I'd like to begin by telling a part of the story of Joy Davidman. Joy Davidman was a well-known and prominent person in her own right, but today most people would know her as the wife of C.S. Lewis. They were married for only 4 years before her death in 1960. Before meeting C.S. Lewis, Joy Davidman was well known as an American poet and writer in her own right, and who often had been referred to as a child prodigy. She came from a Polish Orthodox Jewish background. Although her grandfather was devout, her father was an outspoken atheist. Her father instilled within her not only his own commitment to atheism, but also a self-confidence and a high sense of self-esteem that, combined with her great intelligence, enabled her to become a high achiever early in life, earning a master's degree from Columbia University at the tender age of just 20. Some suggested, in fact, that her self-confidence and her high self-esteem bordered on arrogance and even egotism, something that she herself would have admitted later on in her life. Now, despite her early success, Joy's life was, however, shaken by a series of events that revealed that beneath her, the surface of her self-confidence and arrogance, there was, in fact, a deep fear of loneliness and failure. Her life came to a crisis point when she discovered that her first husband had been unfaithful to her, after which his life collapsed in an alcoholic breakdown. And she was left on her own with 2 small sons and a very inadequate income. Her own sense of pride prevented her from going back to her parents. Such an act would have been a humiliation for her, because they had advised her against the marriage in the first place. After receiving the news of her husband's breakdown, she found herself alone in her New York apartment, with her children asleep in bed, with no one left to call. In the stillness and quiet of that night, where she was confronted with her own fears and her own aloneness for the first time in her life, she writes that all her defenses, the walls of arrogance and cocksureness and self-love, behind which she had hidden from God, all of that momentarily went down, and God came in. She describes her experience of God as follows: "It is infinite, unique. There are no words, there are no comparisons. Can one scoop up the sea in a teacup? Those who have known God will understand me. The others, I find, can neither listen nor understand. There was a person with me in that room, directly present to my consciousness, a person so real that all my precious life was, by comparison, a mere shadow play, and I myself was more alive than I had ever been. It was like waking from sleep. So intense a life cannot be endured long by flesh and blood. We must ordinarily take our life watered down, diluted, as it were, by time and space and matter. My perception of God lasted perhaps half a minute. And during that half minute, Joy was stunned to find herself on her knees praying. She later wrote how on that day she became the world's most surprised atheist. In that moment, she later wrote, God came in, and I changed. I have been turning into a different person since that half minute. In Matthew 5 verse 8 we read the words of Jesus, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." I don't believe that Joy Davidman would have suggested that her heart had suddenly become pure on that day. But in that momentary lapse of concentration, when her egotistical arrogance and cocksureness slipped for the first time and her defenses were down, a crack appeared, through which the light of God could enter. And in a metaphorical sense, in that half a minute, she caught a glimpse of God that changed her life forever. It didn't remove the arrogance once and for all, but it reorientated her life in a whole new direction that would have lasting consequences for her. A process that she referred to as an ongoing conversion of life, slowly but surely, turning her into a different person under the influence of God. Blessed are the pure in heart, says Jesus, for they will see God. In our passage today, the Greek word for pure is katharos. The word katharos is a root word of our English word cathartic, which is a process of purging in order to facilitate healing. It could mean emptying or cleansing the bowels, but it's also used in a psychological sense of releasing strong emotions so that inner psychological healing and letting go can take place. In its ancient usage, it could simply mean to be clean, as clothes have been soiled, that have been soiled with dirt and have been washed are now clean. In its ancient meaning, it was also most especially used as referring to substances like milk or wine, or even that of a metal that was not mixed with another substance or an impurity. And so the basic meaning of katharos is for something to be unmixed, unadulterated, unalloyed, in its most pristine and untainted state, and therefore something clean and pure. One of the best descriptions that I've ever read of a pure heart is from Stephen Mitchell's book, The Gospel of Jesus. He writes, "What is purity of heart? If we compare God to sunlight, we can say that the heart is like a window. Cravings, aversions, fixed judgments, concepts, beliefs, all forms of selfishness or self-protection are, when we cling to them, like dirt on the window pane. The thicker the dirt, the more opaque the window. When there is no dirt, the window is by its own nature perfectly transparent, and the light can stream through it without hindrance." And he goes on, "What can we compare a pure heart, or we can compare a pure heart to a spacious, light-filled room. People or possibilities open the door and walk in, and the room will receive them, however many they are, for as long as they want to stay, and will let them leave when they want to. Whereas a corrupted heart is like a room cluttered with valuable possessions in which the owner sits behind a locked door with a loaded gun." And so Stephen Mitchell describes those with pure hearts as having a radiance about them, a lightness, a brightness, and an openness. He goes on to suggest that as we read the gospel stories about Jesus, we see a radiance in him and a large-hearted openness that was able to welcome and create room for both sinner and saint alike. Those who encountered Jesus, whose own hearts were open enough to perceive it, found in his presence a deep peace and a sense of respect and reverence for him that far exceeded what they had seen or experienced in any other human being. There was a presence about Jesus. In giving up his self-preoccupation, Jesus became filled with the vivid reality of what Stephen Mitchell calls the unnameable. His personality became like a magnetic field, and those who were drawn to him had a hunger for the real. The closer they approached him, the more they could sense the purity of his heart and the radiance of God shining through him. Joy Davidsman's experience reveals that the pure-heartedness of Jesus is in fact accessible to all of us. For a moment, her defenses were down, and the light of God shone through. And then a moment later, her defenses went up again, and the fullness of her experience of the divine again became shrouded. But for half a minute, she experienced the reality that Jesus lived in as a permanent state. She had caught a glimpse of God. Jesus lived in that radiance of God's presence as an ongoing experience, an ongoing reality. And in this sixth beatitude, Jesus suggests that this is an experience that is open to all of us. It is in fact the birthright of every human being made in the image of God. We all have a bright and clear window of the soul, which is capable of allowing the fullness of God's light and radiance to shine through, giving us a new vision of the world as radiant with the presence of the divine. The only thing preventing the light from shining through is the dirt and the grime and the filters of our own egotism, our fixed, rigid beliefs and ideas, our self-preoccupation and our self-concern that prevents us from seeing clearly. One of the theological strands in the Old Testament asserted that it was not possible to see God and yet still live. And we see that in Exodus 33 verse 20, God says to Moses, "You cannot see my face, for a human being shall not see me and live." There's a great spiritual truth expressed in those words. In order to truly see God, there is a dying to self that needs to happen, a giving up of the self, until all that is left is the clear, bright window of the soul, through which God's light, goodness, and love can shine. The dying, crucified Jesus is perhaps one of the most profound religious symbols of that process of self-emptying, of dying to the self, a self-emptying that gives rise to yet another of the great symbols of spiritual transformation in our Christian tradition, the resurrection, the unhindered light of God shining through our humanity. William Barclay suggests that this beatitude invites us into a lifelong process of self-examination, in which we become more and more aware of our mixed motives. The pure of heart are ultimately those who have given up all hidden agendas and are motivated only by the purity of God's divine love. The more we become aware of our hidden agendas, our self-protectionism, our self-preoccupation, our rigid beliefs and judgments, the more God is able to clean away the dirt from the windows of our souls, helping us to see the divine radiance that is shining all around. There's a line from one of Leonard Cohen's songs that I quoted on the day of my installation in Drumore. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. For Joy Davidman, the initial crack which let the light in came when her defenses were down, and she became acutely aware of her own emptiness, loneliness, and vulnerability. And I've come to believe from my own life that it is often through our failures and our weakness and our vulnerability that the cracks of our well-defended lives begin to allow the light of God to come through. What God is looking for is not perfection from us. All God needs are a few cracks. When we become increasingly aware of our imperfections, our flaws, and our cracks, and we are able to be honest with ourselves and others about those flaws, then God's light is given space to shine through us. But as long as we deny that there is any dirt on the window of our soul, as long as we sit in the crowded room of our own hearts, sitting behind a closed door with a weapon trying to defend ourselves, to that extent, God's light is hindered from shining through us, and our ability to see God's shining radiance all around us is blocked. The first step towards a pure heart is simply becoming honest about the dirt and the grime on the window pane. Blessed are the pure in heart, says Jesus, for they shall see God. Amen.